Welcome back to another episode of the Genius Podcast. My name is Karen Doyle, your host and founder of the Genius Project, an initiative for Catholic women designed to support and resource you towards growth in all areas of life, spiritual, personal, and professional. We seek to do this through the Catholic Women's Masterclass, the Genius Podcast, which you're listening to, our online courses and resources, and our Catholic Mindset Coaching programs for women. If you would like to find out about any of these initiatives, you can visit our website www.geniusproject.co, or you can come and follow me on Instagram genius_project_daily. You can also watch the live recordings of these podcast episodes on the Genius Project YouTube channel. So I invite you to go and have a look, press subscribe so that you can be notified every time a new episode drops. On this week's episode of the Genius Podcast, Brya is joining me on a discussion around women's mental health, how we can steward our minds and our body and our soul in such a way that sees us living a life of wholeness in Christ. She really focuses on the integration of our faith in terms of managing mental health, stress, overwhelm, and anxiety. And she gives us some very practical tips and tools of how we as women can navigate this area of our life. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Brya Hanan. Well, Brya, welcome to the Genius Podcast. It's lovely having you joining us today all the way from Arizona in the United States. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a thrill, a joy to be here.
Well, I'm really excited about our conversation today because I think this is a topic that affects all women of all ages and stages of life in different ways. And today we're going to be talking about, I guess, nurturing our mental health and caring for ourselves and what we can do, I guess, when we find ourselves in those sticky spots in life where we become overwhelmed, or it goes a little bit further to burnout and perhaps into things like anxiety and depression and other areas. So I'm very excited for you to be sharing with us today. You've got a lot of wealth of knowledge and expertise in this area. But before we dive into the conversation, would you give us a little bit of background about who you are and where you live and how you came to be doing what you're doing today?
Sure, yes. So my name is Brya Hanan, and I do live in sunny Arizona. It's about 110 right now degrees
So nice.
Fahrenheit. And I am a wife and mother of two littles, a 3.5 and a 1.5-year-old. And I have my own private practice, Hanan Hope and Healing. And I provide virtual services, psychotherapy, and coaching services. And I support people in all walks of life. And essentially, what I'm going to be talking to you about today, what we're going to be kind of unpacking, is the work that I get to do with people on an individual level. I also see couples as well and apply some of the concept to couples as well. I really believe this work begins with the family. And so, especially with healthy marriages. So I oftentimes do a lot of that work first with the couples, and then the hope is to bring it into their individual lives and then to their children. So that's kind of an overview. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So tell me, how did you end up in this work?
Yeah, so it really feels like something that the Lord has placed in my heart since I was little. I've always wanted to help people. Mm-hmm. And so my whole life's discovery is how. And when I went to college and undergrad, I had an idea of what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a child psychologist. And as I was experiencing psychology classes, going through the material, I found myself more moved by the idea of entering into stories and really getting to know the heart, the mind, the body of a person. And some of the work within child psychology was a lot more like assessment based, where you didn't get to know the person at a deeper level. And so just kind of listening to the promptings of the Holy Spirit and what excited me, and if I read something and that really seemed to move me, and just trying to follow all of those little promptings. And then it led me to counseling psychology. And then from there, again, kind of going back to this idea of the family and the importance of the family, it led me to marriage and family therapy. And so I thought that would be the best use also of my gifts and the things that I was noticing within myself and the things that I felt passionate about. And so, yeah, that's kind of how
Beautiful.
I got to be where I am today. Yeah.
Fantastic. So good. And I guess in the work that you get to do, you have a front row seat to the lives of women, particularly. You work with couples, but particularly with women, you have this front row seat where you are witnessing firsthand some of the challenges and pressures that we all face as women, right? I think Jesus said in scripture, you know, when the day of trouble comes, and somehow we're surprised when we hit those rapids of life where things are turbulent. And I think sometimes we don't know where to find our guideposts and how to navigate those waters. But can you share with me how, I guess, what are some of the big pressures that you see women facing? You have this front row seat. What are you seeing as some of the themes in the lives of women?
Well, I'd say the majority of my caseload are women. Women seem to reach out for support more, which is wonderful. But I think the main thing that I hear is the pressure to be perfect, and also the tendency to control. So those are the two things. And so with the perfectionism, I think women live with a lot of shoulds. This is true for single women to mothers, right? Typically it goes like, I should be married by now, or I should be this mom who's able to smile and never have an angry moment, or lash out or feel anxious, right? So I think that's one piece of it. And then with that comes the control, because women feel a tremendous amount of pressure to be a certain way or to show up in a certain way. They have a tendency to unconsciously kind of control their either conversations or their behavior, and not really rely on the Lord as much, right? There's this kind of inner battle happening. So yeah, I'll pause there.
No, that's fantastic. I love the one where you say we suffer under all of these shoulds, the shoulda, woulda, coulda mentality. I think, can you explain that a little bit more about where that comes from for women and where this need for perfectionism comes from?
Yes. So I specialize in kind of early childhood trauma. And so I unpack a lot of childhood stories. And so it seems to come from those early experiences with our caregivers. And so if you experienced a caregiver who was maybe more critical, or perhaps they didn't even say anything at all, but they weren't really affirming, oftentimes we as women or small girls will internalize those messages or those experiences of not being affirmed or really seen or heard. And then we feel like we need to do more to earn our parents' attention or affection, right? So we learn from really young age that the only way I get mommy and daddy's love and care is if I perform, right? If I am always happy, I put on a smiley face, if I don't get my dress dirty, all of these different things that help us to get what we desire most, which is connection. And so I think it comes from that. And then we internalize all certain kinds of messages from there on out with our peers in school, with our teachers, with our first boyfriend, right? All of these different things that make us believe that, no, I should be like this, right? This is the only way that I get the affection or the care or the love.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you highlight something. I love how you use the word stories, because I think we forget that we all have a story, and it's neutral because it's just simply what happened to us or our circumstances in life. But then we do get to, as we become adults, get to reframe, I guess, our interpretation of that story. And that actually has the power to change the trajectory of our lives. Can you speak a little bit into that? Because sometimes I think my experience in coaching some women when they come to me is that they feel powerless. They feel a victim to their circumstance. I think that what we need to hear more of as women is this message that we actually have far more power than we realize. And when we cooperate with God's grace, that's where real transformation happens. So can I ask you just to speak into, I guess, that victim sort of mindset that sometimes we have over our lives, and how women might shift out of that even just a little bit to start taking steps forward?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think from like a nervous system perspective, when we are feeling like we can't be this woman that we should be, right? We start to shut down. Like our nervous system will start to get us in this kind of a collapse, helpless state, which looks like kind of feeling like a victim, right? We start to feel like I can't do anything. And so our bodies communicate to us first before we have any cognitive thought of like, I can't do it or I'm powerless, right? Our bodies will communicate that to us, but by a sense of maybe a lack of motivation or a feeling of just lethargy or tiredness all the time. And then we start to feel or start to maybe have those more cognitive thoughts of like, I am powerless or I can't do it or I'm just too broken or my past has been too terrible. There's no way I can be this woman that I'm called to be today. So the way that I typically address that then is to connect with the body first and to experience that internal security and safety in our body. So helping women to start to understand where those feelings come from, I think are a first step. And recognize too, like, I think it's nice to kind of humanize those experiences and recognize like we all have a nervous system that when we're feeling really stressed and we feel like we can't live up to those shoulds, our nervous system will tend to move us into a place of survival. So I think when we phrase it in that way, it helps women to feel like, oh, okay, it's more of my body doing what it needs to do to create a sense of homeostasis, of keeping me safe, right? Instead of, oh, I'm, such a loser for not being able to kind of get out of this state or to be more motivated or empowered, right? So from there, I think then with that kind of more gentle approach and that lens of connecting with body, creating safety in body, then we can kind of look like going back to the stories, unpack those stories, challenge some of those beliefs that they may have adopted along the way. And I think that's how we can create like a new mindset where they can see themselves the way that truly that God sees us, right? And then that is probably the next phase in all of this is the hope is that as we increase safety and security in our body, we also experience safety and security with our Lord so that when we're telling ourselves those truths or maybe relying on the truths that the Lord has given us, we actually believe it. Because that seems to be the other disconnect is we'll say the positive things or we'll hear it or pray for it, but we don't actually believe it. There's parts of us that don't.
Yeah,
I think that would be the next phase of that.
Yeah, beautiful. I love that model. And the way that you're sort of putting language around the experience is really important because sometimes I think we can forget we are this unity of body and soul. And there's a beautiful book that's, I can't remember who the author is, you would know, but The Body Keeps the Score. That just our body stores all of the traumas and all of the experiences. And I think that's where we sort of start to look at things like mental health and anxiety and depression, because sometimes that's the body manifesting some of those stories and those emotions, which is powerful. So I think this idea that is really important is that we are this unity of body and soul. So what's happening in our emotional world does impact us physically, and our physical bodies impact our emotions. And I think that's a great place to start. And I love that you pick up on that. When we're talking about mental health, and this is a term, and well-being, it's thrown around. It's a very trendy kind of catchphrase these days. But there's a gravity to that. I think our mental health is actually quite fragile, and we need to be really good stewards. The Bible talks about, our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, and the Spirit of God dwells within us. So we are called to steward our minds. We're called to steward our bodies and our emotions well. I'd love just to unpack a little bit about this term mental health and well-being so that we can understand what it is. I think that when we have knowledge, when we have an understanding, then we can take steps to really start to care for it and nurture ourselves. So can you speak around, I guess, what is mental health and what can we do as women to nurture that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I love that you're making those connections too between the body, because I don't see mental health as separate from our body and being good stewards of our body and our souls as well. But I think the way that I would define it first is just taking care of the way we think, right? Learning how to understand what's going on in our minds I think is a big piece of mental health, right? And the stories that we have that have created kind of our mental process, our thoughts, our core beliefs, also our emotions and how we experience those emotions would all be under, I think, mental health. But I think the more that we understand this field, the more we discover new research, we recognize that it's so much more than just the mind, as I just said. So it's really about nurturing the self, nurturing your sense of identity. And what I tell my clients is learning how to become and live as in the image and likeness of God. So reclaim that. So I would say that when we disconnect from our mental health and we don't take good care of our mental health, it starts to impact everything else. And we start to lose our God-given dignity and who we are at our core, which is being made in the image and likeness of God. So I think mental health is I love that word, being good stewards and nurturing, right? It's about kind of reclaiming that and through the mind, through the body, right? And then nurturing our relationship or spirituality with God.
Beautiful. I think one of the words that I love to use when talking about mental health is it's living this integrated life and living a life of wholeness. And I like that you point out that mental health is not separate to who we are. It's not an add-on that we might have this thing sitting over here. We're this unity of body and soul. So what's going on is actually really, really important. And I think the goal is not so much sort of mastering mental health, so to speak, because there is a lot of that language in the secular world, but to really live into this life of wholeness and to receive restoration through Christ and through his grace, because there's so much that we can do, but ultimately that final layer and what really brings it together is the grace of God. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the role of our faith in walking this journey towards wholeness and integration?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And so I talked about earlier how women tend to control, right? When they start to recognize some of that perfectionism and the shoulds that they've been living with, they will unconsciously, utilize different defense mechanisms to basically empower themselves or feel a sense of control. So I think where our faith comes in is it's learning how to surrender and to trust that God is good and that we don't have to live with so many defense mechanisms and try to work really hard to be this perfect version of self that's really unattainable, right? It's learning how to kind of be more compassionate towards ourselves as Christ is compassionate towards us. And so I really believe like the whole work should always model after Christ and what he does or how he shows up with us. And so you're basically taking that, how the Lord shows up, how he compassionately enters into our suffering, how he works with our littleness, our fragility, and we're basically using that model in the way that we take care of ourselves, become good stewards of ourselves. And then in that too, we develop what I call, or not what I call, but attachment researchers call earned security. And so we might have more of an insecure attachment style or these kind of childhood experiences that have made us really insecure people. And so as we develop that, as we model after Christ, it ends up also impacting our faith so that we can show up more securely with God and actually trust him, actually let go and believe he'll take care of us. And in a sense too, it's a really interesting thing because we're talking about empowerment, but we're also in this work, it's kind of ironic that you also become more dependent. You become more childlike, right? And so it's a both and. It's learning how to care for self and become empowered and feel secure and strong, but also learning to surrender and let go and allow God to just take care of us.
I love that. It's so beautiful. And there's that real level of receptivity and humility that we need, that I think so much of our struggles as women, I know this is true in my life, I see it in the lives of the women I coach, is that we start to get on this treadmill of anxiety when we're trying to, we feel like it all depends on us. And for women in family, sometimes I mean, the objective reality is a lot of it does depend on us. So we might not necessarily change the circumstances, but we can change how we show up in those circumstances. And that, if we can sort of do a little bit of work on ourselves in that area, then that can change our experience of anxiety and things like depression and feeling overwhelmed and burnt out. Can you share with me a little bit about how women can do that? They might not, for example, you might have a woman who is a single mother and she's juggling all the things. It's quite overwhelming, working a full-time job, managing the children. You might have a woman who's in a difficult marriage and the husband expects her to do everything and she's feeling really overwhelmed. Those circumstances aren't changing in the short term, but what can she do to manage herself in the midst of those challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I actually have a process that I teach women that I think I could probably share here that might be helpful to answer that question. And so I call it the 5 A's. And so the first thing that a woman can do is just get anchored. And that looks like getting connected with body, right? Getting connected with soul, slowing down, taking a deep breath, because you're absolutely right. Her circumstances might not change. She might be in the thick of something really stressful. And it might really be all on her. She might not have a lot of support, but something that she can do is just kind of deep breathe, right? Learn those regulation tools to help her to maintain her peace, right? And the anchor piece too is also learning how to pray and cry out to God, right? Being really honest about what's going on in her life. And then the second A is acknowledge. So from there, I start to feel more peace. I'm maybe feeling like, okay, I'm crying out to the Lord. I'm getting more regulation in my body. Now I have the cognitive space to acknowledge what's going on. So I might acknowledge that I'm feeling really stressed out right now and really anxious with all that's going on. I'm feeling like my husband's not supporting me, and that makes me feel really sad and alone or lonely. And so what tends to happen, and it might sound like, okay, well, why acknowledge it, right? We have things to do. There's still tasks to be done. Won't that make me kind of fall into the feelings even more, fall into despair, right? But what we find in this work and through research is that simply acknowledging our experience actually empowers us more, and we feel more connected to self, connected to others, more open and receptive. And we also feel more attuned, which is the third A. And so attunement is all about really not only acknowledging what we feel, but allowing ourselves to actually feel it. And so allowing ourselves to go through those emotions, to cry, to maybe we need to like throw something at the wall, right? Of course, don't hurt anybody, but just allow ourselves to process those emotions. And that's where the nurturing piece, right? Being able to also validate those emotions. It's okay to feel this way. It's okay that things are really hard. And then the fourth A is to ask. And so we also learn to ask for what we might be needing, right? Ask for help, ask the Lord for particular grace. We might need to ask our inner self, like, what is it that I'm really needing right now? What could help me maybe feel a little bit more grounded in this moment? And then the last A is act. And so we act on that, whatever the Lord maybe shows us, or maybe we do feel like, really what I'm needing is just a support from a friend or to call a friend. We do that. And then we just keep repeating the steps.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I like the 5 A's. They're great. Can you tell us just very quickly again, those 5 are?
Yes. So it's anchor, acknowledge, attune, ask, act.
Fantastic. And I think it's really helpful to have that. So encourage women to just write those 5 down so that they've got them front of mind. But I think you touched on something about preserving peace. And Father Jacques Philippe talks about in his books, especially the one Interior Freedom, that really the goal in life is to preserve our peace. So we will face battles. We are going to encounter challenges, but the goal is to preserve our peace of heart and mind in the midst of that. And I think you've given us a lovely little action plan there to help women. One of the areas that I think women struggle in is, I think it was the 4th one, or maybe the 3rd, but to acknowledge the needs. we're not actually very good at acknowledging our needs, because so often we fall into this caregiver role where we are pouring ourselves out for others. And often we are doing that at the expense of our own needs. I love that saying, we can't give what we don't possess. And some people have this mindset, and it's a false mindset of, I must give, I must be completely selfless. And we have to balance that with, obviously, we're called to live a selfless life. But even Jesus drew away to a quiet place to restore himself so that he could give. Can you speak a little bit into that false mindset for women and how they can actually challenge that? Because I see that as one of the biggest challenges that women face, is the failure to acknowledge their own needs, and also to give themselves permission to nurture those needs. So how could women get unstuck, I guess, from that mindset?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. I definitely see that with women and within my own self, my own story.
Yeah.
The first thing that comes to mind is interior boundaries, right? So when we think of boundaries, I often think of like, okay, I need to kind of set a limit with a friend, or I need to tell my mom that she can't call me after 9 p.m., right? But boundaries are so much more than that. It's really like what Father Jacques Philippe is talking about with that interior freedom, right? It's basically recognizing my peace is what sustains me. My peace is what connects me to God and keeps me anchored and grounded. And so I can't lose that. And so when we recognize the feelings, when we allow ourselves to acknowledge those, we're also allowing ourselves to work through it, right? So you can't work through anything unless you acknowledge it first. And you're also getting kind of clear, the more that you practice this, what is violating the boundary? What's disrupting my peace, right? So you develop more understanding when you do that kind of interior work of exploration and becoming more curious about what we're feeling. So for example, let's say I am a person who feels the need to make sure everyone else is taken care of, and I have a should that I can never come first, right? My family should always come first, no matter what, right? So that's kind of governing my life. And perhaps I start to notice that I'm getting really anxious, right? So the tendency, I think, for women is like, oh, I can't be anxious, right? I'm going to offer it up quickly, or I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to deny it, right? And just keep myself focused and busy on the task at hand. The food needs to go in the oven, right? I need to do the load of laundry, or whatever that is. And so I think what can happen, what can actually help women is slowing down a little bit, right? Noticing, okay, I'm getting anxious. I'm not going to be able to do these things well unless I tend to myself first. So let me take the deep breath. Let me, do the 5 A's, right? Before I go and do the next thing. And then when we fail to do that, though, we're really violating a boundary, right? We're basically saying, well, I don't really matter. My feelings don't matter. And that is what violates, right, that peace that we're trying to maintain, right? So if one of our values is to be a woman who is full of peace, who shows up joyfully, right, then we have to make sure that we're doing what is necessary then to live by that value, right? And so sometimes we think too, the other kind of, I think, layer is, oh, it's my husband who's disturbing my peace because he's not helping, which could be true, right? That definitely will affect our peace.
Yes.
It's kids who are being too loud or not listening. But really, the only way that we can kind of maintain that peace is taking responsibility for our own responses and reactions, and then doing what's necessary to regulate those feelings that come up. And then that's how we kind of also live by our boundary, if you will. So we're not allowing those other things that are outside of our control to disrupt what we're building internally. I hope that makes sense.
No, it does. No, that's good. Thanks, Brya. Now, you talked about this word tending, and I know there's this phrase, tend and befriend, when we're talking about getting out of that sort of survival mode. Like when the world feels like it's cramming in on us and coming at us from all angles, we do start to get anxious because there's more demands on us than what we have the resources to meet those demands with. Can you speak into that sort of adaptive stress response that you talk about, that tend and befriend, and how that's really key for getting out of that survival kind of cycle?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I love the research on tend and befriend because we have in kind of neuroscience and trauma studies, we've always thought that it's fight, flight, and freeze. And tend and befriend is actually a beautiful adaptation of stress response that actually more women have been able to experience, right, or adapt. Because women naturally want to nurture. We're hardwired to nurture and to connect with others. And it's been safe for us to do that. It's helped us to survive and get to where we are today, right? As we connect with baby and nurture baby, baby grows and thrives, right? If we connect to other women, right, we start to feel a little bit more, supported and connected. And so the research is basically showing that the more we practice this, and then I've also apply it to also our own selves, right? We tend to what's hurting within us, what's scared, what's lonely, what's afraid, and we practice, right, that nurturing or befriending, the same response will happen, right? The same kind of outcome like we do, or like what we experience with our friends or with our baby. We grow, we become more resilient, we feel connected, right? So we can apply all of that to how we show up with our own selves.
Yeah, beautiful. I know there's some research that talks about, I can't remember the correct terminology, but this idea of hugging yourself or just stroking your arm, like it just, there's some very simple little things that seem a bit silly, but it actually has a huge physiological impact on us. Like if we were to just to tend to ourselves by stroking our own hand, or to write in a journal, or what are some of the other ways that practically women can tend to themselves?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So with the anchoring, there's so many ways where you're essentially tending to yourself, right? You're befriending yourself physically. So those are great tools, like the stroking your arm or journaling or writing. But one of the ones that I teach is putting one hand on your heart, one hand on your belly when you breathe. So getting connected that way, kind of tending to yourself that way. There's also something called a butterfly hug. And so if you kind of wrap your arms across and put one hand on your shoulder, and let me see, the one hand on the other shoulder, you probably need a visual to do this, but you're basically flapping back and forth and kind of tapping. And there's some research around that of how that helps kind of regulate ourselves. But I think the important thing is, right, we're experiencing that safe touch and getting connected to our bodies. I would say even singing, right? Even like a spiritual hymn or something like that, kind of humming it to ourselves. That's a good way to kind of tend to ourselves. And also it's like, we're also get to connect with the Lord too through that. Can be really helpful. And then I think some other things too is like I have clients who will wrap themselves in a blanket, or just allow themselves to kind of experience that sense of being kind of enclosed and snuggling up to something. It's really about using our five senses, right? So being able to engage with all five of our senses can also help us to experience that befriending physically.
Beautiful. I love the practical element of that, because I have women who come to me, they say, I understand the theory, but I don't know how to do it. I don't actually know how. I think one of the other things that you picked up on in our conversation before was just about the role of Our Lady, the Blessed Mother, and also other women in our life. Can you speak into that sort of connection community and how important that is for our mental health?
Yes. Well, one of the things I thought about entering into this conversation is that some women don't feel very nurturing. They don't find that feels really natural. And it has to do with trauma, right? Impacting this kind of God-given, I think, part of our like feminine genius, right? That's something that the Lord has given to us, but trauma will impact that. So I was thinking about that of like, how can women really access that and become more nurturing? And I was thinking about just the role of saints and Our Lady. When we develop those strong relationships to other holy and virtuous women, they essentially teach us how to soften our own heart, right? They open us up. They model to us that it can be safe to kind of tap into these things that maybe have felt unsafe, like being just kind to ourselves. That can also feel sometimes unsafe. And we might have learned that the only way to survive is to kind of be really mean to ourselves and kind of whip ourselves into shape, because that's the only way that we're going to kind of maybe do more or achieve this higher level of perfection. And so when we have these relationships where, you experience Our Lady, or you're using kind of imaginative prayer and you see her like, holding you, or, holding your hand, or, I've had clients who've allowed themselves to just be like a child in Mary's arms and just rest there. And so all of those kinds of prayerful experiences, or really learning about Our Lady's heart or particular saints, will give us kind of, I think, the freedom to model it ourselves and experience it on a bodily level too, right? We're experiencing their safety, their befriending, that gives us permission to do it too.
Yeah, beautiful. I just, as you're speaking, I'm reminded of a quote from Saint Joan of Arc, that I see God in my imagination. And I think sometimes when we grow up and, we've got a mortgage and we've got the kids and we've got work and we're juggling all the things, we lose a sense of that childlike need for play and just that laughter and that joy and the silliness of life, which actually isn't that silly. It's actually really, really important. And so our imagination is part of that. And I think the invitation for women is really to slow down a little bit, to encounter the Lord in their imagination, to visualize him coming to them, or Our Lady coming to them, and just nurturing them, because I think that's such a powerful gift that God has given us in our mind.
Absolutely.
Very, very important. I just touched on this idea of play. And I think it's something that we let go of at some point in our lives as women. It's something that we see as maybe frivolous, or life gets a little bit too serious, and we let go of this sense of play. But if you watch a little child playing, there's just this abandonment to joy, this abandonment to the present moment. And whatever's going on, they just carry on and they cope with whatever. But I'd love you to talk for a moment just into the role that play has in our lives as women, and how we can, I guess, reignite some play, and how that's linked, I guess, to our mental health.
Sure. Yeah. Well, something that I teach clients is how to befriend their inner child. So that's another specialty of mine. And I do a lot of writing on it. And so I have all these kinds of ideas are popping up in my mind right now, because that's really the bulk of my work, is helping women to and men and couples to experience that inner child, that child who can play, who can wonder, who can delight and be free in the moment. But I think, just to offer some kind of an entry into this, is really to start remembering, right? Like who I was before I got really busy, before the kids, before I got married, right? And maybe looking at old pictures and seeing yourself through that lens. Because you're right, we do get disconnected from that sense of self, right? We could become really busy, and we might feel like it is frivolous to, go and pick flowers or go jump on a trampoline, right? Other things to do. But I think just simply remembering that child self and remembering that I actually did those things, and I delighted, and I slowed down, and I felt joy and peace, helps awaken something within us. And then that will give us more curiosity and openness to explore that further.
That's beautiful. And I think just what you said is looking at pictures, but also asking some questions like, when did I last play? What brings me this, this unhindered, unrestrained joy where I just feel alive, and reconnecting with some of those activities. I know in relationships education, we often say to couples who might be hitting those rocky roads, is just what brought you together? What were the activities that, you drew you together in the first place, and returning to those a little bit. And I think there's that muscle memory or that body memory that when we encounter play, it takes us back to being a child, and it lifts us beyond the present moment. I think that the Lord just loves and delights in us when we're playing.
Absolutely.
It also reminds me of just, a child is totally dependent, and up until a certain age, they really don't care what people think, and they just are in the present. I think that's an invitation for us as women, is just to encounter that child within, but understanding that we have this God in heaven who just loves us beyond all measure, and he delights in us, and he's full of joy when we're playing and we're abandoned to that present moment. Brya, can you tell me, we're just sort of in wrapping up now, I guess we've got some of those more extreme, I guess there's extreme mental illness that people may suffer with. There's things like depression and anxiety, which we hear those words, but they can be quite debilitating experiences for women. I want you to speak in just for a moment around, I guess, women who are genuinely struggling with mental illness, mental health. Like, have you got some thoughts or some words of encouragement for them?
Yes. Well, something that I found in my work is really when we rediscover our authentic core, authentic self, right? Maybe it's that child within, right? To use that language. There's no illness or anything that we're struggling with that can really take us away from that, right? It's like, I see it as like almost an umbilical cord back to God. And so I think what comes up for me is just really sharing a message of hope that no matter what you're going through or how severe it is, you can always have access to that, and especially with support. And really, that's a huge, I think, need for women, is to have a community of support, because we can't do it alone. And especially if there's really debilitating, psychosomatic kind of things going on, you're going to need more of that. And support doesn't just look like a community. It could also look like, oh gosh, my mind's blanking now.
It's okay. Would that be a psychologist?
I was going to say it. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Support can also look like a psychologist, seeing a therapist, right? Also taking medication or seeing a psychiatrist. I think that that's all okay, because the Lord is inviting us all into healing and wholeness and integration. And I would say for those who have, severe anxiety or depression or perhaps something else, a personality disorder, the same invitation is for those people as well. And so those who struggle with those kinds of debilitating disorders are just going to need a little bit more support.
Fantastic. And I think giving yourself permission, not being too hard on yourself, that we have that inner critic and that judgmental voice that can be so harsh to us as women. And I think the Lord really wants to just invite us that if this is where you're at, this is where you're at, and he meets us exactly in that place and wants to bring that restoration and peace. What about the women who are overwhelmed and stressed? What are some of the things that they can do today to help them, I guess, come back to themselves and manage that stress in a more productive way?
Yes. Yeah. I think I want to go back to a woman who might be struggling with a severe mental illness, because I think this will also connect to a woman who feels really overwhelmed. But learning how to regulate your nervous system and getting connected with your body is so important for every domain of our life. And so I say too, because it sometimes can feel really overwhelming to look at the thoughts or the beliefs or enter into the feelings without any connection to body or knowing how to regulate our nervous system well. So I would say just starting off really small with, taking a deep breath. It might sound really simple and too like elementary, but it's one of the best ways to get connected really quickly, especially when we're taking deep breaths, right? Really from your belly, holding that breath all the way up in your chest and lungs, holding it there, and then bringing it back down towards your belly. So that's the first thing. And then I would say too, just going on a walk, right? That's kind of intentionally helping you get connected. And then when you think about it, when you're walking, you're integrating the left and the right side of your brain. The right and left hemisphere have to work together to create that movement, which also helps us to regulate our parasympathetic nervous system, our heart rate, all of those kinds of things that will help us to feel that sense of feeling a little bit more peace or anchored or connected. So I would say those two ways are simple things that you can do just today to just feel more of yourself, to slow down. And that's true for someone who's really overwhelmed, as someone who's having a severe, severe anxiety.
Yeah, fantastic. And then I want to highlight just these pillars. Like there's these 4 pillars that are really obvious and really basic, but sometimes we miss them. But they go a long way to nurturing, protecting our mental health. And that's sort of exercise, sleep, good nutrition, connection, water, those very basic things, but they are so powerful. I think if you can just sort of, and prayer, just getting that sort of time and space as well. I think they're really important keys that if we can put those pillars in place, they change a lot.
Yes. And I would add to that too, if sometimes we might look at those and go, oh, but I can't sleep, right? It's been so hard to sleep, or I'm too busy to drink water. These things that seem simple could feel really hard for some people. I would say, don't worry about the full list. Focus on the one that seems the easiest, right? And just start there and just build it into your daily habit. And then you'll be surprised that the more you practice one of those simple things or keys, you'll be able to do more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that saying, small changes may consistently make all the difference. There's no point doing a massive overhaul because chances are, like New Year's resolutions, they never stick.
Yeah.
Brya, thank you so much. That's such an insightful conversation, and I really love talking with you. If women are interested in finding out more about you or your services, where can they find you?
Yes, you can find me on my website. It's my first and last name, Brya Hanan, LMFT.com. And I have a bunch of different resources on there and also free resources as well. So take a look at that on the resource tab. And then they can also find me on Instagram at Brya Hanan, LMFT.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And I'll put some links in the show notes as well. But thank you for joining us, and God bless your beautiful work.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, ladies, I really hope and pray that conversation gave you some really powerful insights into how you can manage stress, anxiety, overwhelm, and mental health. If you would like to find out more about Brya's work, you can visit her website, www.bryahanan.lmft.com, or you can follow her on Instagram, Brya Hanan. If you've liked what you've heard on the Genius podcast, could I ask you to do a small favor for me and head on over to the podcast platform that you're listening to this episode on and leave a review and a rating. This only takes a few short moments, but it really helps to support the work of the Genius podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram, genius_project_daily. Ladies, if you'd like to go a little bit further with some of the content that we've discussed in today's episode, can I invite you to visit our website and check out the Catholic Women's Masterclass. In the Genius Project Catholic Women's Masterclass, we take women through a 4-month journey of transformation. We look at establishing these rhythms of renewal in our life that will see us live a life of integration and wholeness in Christ. The program is made up of a number of online learning modules as well as fortnightly group coaching sessions with myself and the rest of the group. So ladies, if you're looking to establish some new rhythms, if you need a recalibration in your life and you like to do that with the support of a mentor and a sisterhood of other women, come on over and visit the website www.geniusproject.co, where you can find out more information on the masterclass page. Until next week, ladies, have a great week. God bless you, and we'll see you next week on the Genius Podcast.